Well, I want to welcome you to our session on collective worship in schools. And I'm really pleased to say that Helen Craig, who is our specialist on exactly this area from the schools team, is going to be doing most of the thinking and most of the speaking for us today, which is an entirely good thing. But I'm just going to start. Now, I'm not a specialist in collective worship, far from it. My name's Andy. I coordinate the training team for the Diocese of Chelmsford. And I'm going to be starting by talking about a context that's much bigger than schools. If I may. I'm going to be talking about a Christendom culture and an invitational culture. A Christendom culture is one where there is an assumption that the people that we communicate with are Christians, that their worldview is broadly a Christian one, that they behave in broadly Christian ways, or if they don't, they know that is the ideal from which they are falling short. This can have quite a strong form in which there's an assumption that people are somehow abnormal if they're not Christian, or a weaker form in which it's just, generally speaking, we are expecting that the inhabitants of this culture are Christians unless they're opting out in some way or wearing a hijab or a turban, in which case we're willing to accept that they might be exceptions to the general rule. And you and I may well have been to schools where that was indeed the assumption made by Christians and others who are leading us, not least in collective worship. We have moved, people of God, from a Christendom assumption about the world. It was probably never accurate, but it's certainly not the way that we think about society now. And we've moved from a world where we assumed Christianity to one where we assume nothing. It doesn't mean that we assume people are not Christians. It means that it would be foolish for us to make any assumption at all about somebody's beliefs till we get to know them. And certainly it would be unwise to make assumptions about the beliefs and religious affiliation of a large group of people with whom we're interacting. So what are we doing? We're not assuming Christianity. We're not assuming its opposites. All we're doing is we're inviting. We are inviting people to a life-giving relationship with Jesus Christ, and we're inviting people to see the world in a way that fits with Christian faith. We're not compelling, we are inviting. And there's three things that in this new invitational culture where we find ourselves, there are three things that we're avoiding. And those three things that we're avoiding in inviting are guilt, fear, and exclusion. I'll go through them one by one, if I may. We are not trying to make people feel guilty in order that they accept the invitation of Jesus, the invitation to see the world in a different way. This does not mean that there is not real objective guilt. If I've done something wrong, I'm guilty whether I feel it or not. but it does mean making people feel guilty, or trying to make people feel guilty, is not a legitimate move, not a Jesus move, either in a church context or in a school context. And we've both seen unfortunate, or I suspect seen, unfortunate examples where people try to do this, where people are not actually feeling guilty, and a Christian speaker tries to convince them that they really should be feeling a lot more guilty and a lot more miserable than they are now. It's like the snake oil salesman who tries to convince you that you're sick in order to buy the product. As I say, none of this is telling us or trying to tell us that guilt is not real. It is saying making people feel guilty is not a legitimate way to live out the Christian vocation in an invitational culture. Fear, somewhat similar. I am not telling you there is nothing to be afraid of. I am not telling you hell does not exist. But I am telling you that Jesus does not want us to make people afraid by our intensity or our scary stories in order to frighten them into following the way of Jesus. God is love, and in God there is no darkness, and love drives out fear. So when we say there is no place for trying to make people afraid, we are making a statement about collective worship, but we're also making a statement about Christian ministry. That isn't how we do things. And finally, an invitational culture has no place for exclusion. And that can be at a very big level. An exclusionary kind of culture could say, there is no place for you in this country if you are not a Christian. That would be the most dramatic way, and I think we could all pretty quickly see the problem with that. You do not belong unless you believe as we do and behave as we do. But then there are less extreme forms. You don't really belong in this village unless you believe as we do or behave as we do, or in this part of town. You do not belong in this church building unless you believe as we do or behave as we do. You don't belong at this food bank unless you believe as we do or behave as we do. And of course, you do not belong at this school unless you believe as we do or behave as we do. All of these are entirely illegitimate in a culture of invitation. This does not mean that there is no such thing as the people of God and that has boundaries. It means that we are offering freely all that Jesus is giving to us and offering to the world, with no attempt to exclude anybody from that wonderful offer. People belong, generally speaking, long before they start to believe and behave in the ways that meet that belonging. And we long for our churches and our schools and our communities to be places where people can belong, regardless of what at this point they believe and how at this point they behave. So, an invitational culture. One more thing before I hand over to Helen, just in case all my words on invitation have been misunderstood, which would be entirely my fault if that had happened. I don't mean by invitational culture a culture in which we are inviting people to come to church on Sunday mornings? I mean, we might, but that's not in the first sense what I mean by saying an invitational culture. Sometimes it will never be appropriate to invite somebody to our particular congregation on a Sunday morning, because we know that that congregation isn't set up in a way that will be attractive and appropriate for them. But in every case, invitation in the first instance means invitation to see the world a certain way before it involves any kind of religious observance. Invitational culture is about what the writer and philosopher Charles Taylor calls inviting to a new imaginary. And by an imaginary, he means a way of seeing the world. We as Christians have a way of seeing the world that has Jesus at the heart of it. A world where love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, patience, faithfulness, self-control. If I missed one, I'm not sure anyway. Where the fruits of the Spirit are the lifeblood and way of experiencing the world and acting in it. A world which has hope in it, because God's going to put the world to rights, and there will be no more pain, and no more hurt, and no more evil, and no more alienation, and no more injustice, and no more unbelief. That the world as it should be is the world that will be one day. And we are inviting people to imagine that world. And you and I know that this is not some sort of flight into myth and unreality. You and I know that the world centered on Jesus is real. That Jesus really is the heart of everything. That love, joy, peace, patience, I'm not going to go through the list again, really are the important qualities for human flourishing. That God really is going to put the world to rights. All of this is true. But of course, most people in our world don't see it as true. So what do? We do not compel, but we invite them to see the world a different way. It's amazing, isn't it? Even God is not willing to force people to see things God's way. It would be really strange if people leading collective worship in East London and Essex found themselves to be more compelling, more forcing of the issue than God is. We give freedom, but we do so with grace and winsomeness and prayer, and we point beyond ourselves. So that's my attempt at introduction to the theme. We are no longer in Christendom, but we are in an invitational world where it is okay to invite, as long as we do so without guilt and fear and exclusion. I'm going to stop talking and hand over to Helen, who's going to take us on for the rest of our session.
Thank you very much, Andy, for that. Just like to introduce myself. My name is Helen Craig. You can contact me at hcraig@chelmsford.anglican.org at any time. my background, I am now an education advisor. I work in one of the teams, in the team of education. My background, I've been in education. I've just been thinking about it for over 30 years as from an early NQT to head teacher, and now work with the advisors. And I also have the role for collective worship in the whole of the diocese. I was reflecting on when Andy was talking about how we've moved to Christendom in the fact that when I was at university studying education, I did my dissertation on collective worship in schools way back in 1980. So goodness me, if I'd have known then that I'd be a collective worship lead in schools, I don't think I'd have ever believed it. So firstly, thank you all very much for your time this afternoon. It really is appreciated and valued by the schools that you support. What I intend to do this afternoon in the time that I've been given is to share the guidance, the Church of England guidance on collective worship in schools with you, answer any questions at that point, and then also share some top tips with you on leading collective worship in schools. These are tips that head teachers have shared with me, and my own experience as a head with visitors leading worship. So hopefully you might find them helpful as well. So there'll be two opportunities for questions, because in this format it is a little bit challenging to answer questions as we go. So I'm just going to start by sharing my screen. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. Andy, could you just give the thumbs up if you can see that okay for me? Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. Okay. This is where it all freezes on you, doesn't it? Bear with me one moment, please. So I'm just going to start with thinking about your memories of collective worship. I'd like just a pause to make you think, and what collective worship means to you. Just have and why do you think it might be described as the beating heart of school life? So your memories of collective worship, what do you think it means to you? And why do you think it's the beating heart of school life? If anybody feels able to take their mic off and share, that would be really lovely. I'm afraid I can't see you all from now that I'm sharing, I know, but if anybody would like to share from any of those other questions, it would be really helpful.
I remember singing a lot, and singing makes people really feel as if they've come together and shared something.
Fantastic, thank you. Sorry, nice power, thank you, it's lovely. Anyone else? I think singing's very important.
I can remember a time when the Roman Catholic children didn't come to assembly, and so they seemed to breed apart. And as a sort of 8-10-year-old, it made me feel that Roman Catholics, there's something funny about them.
Yeah. Indeed, sometimes that's separation. That can cause a lack of understanding, can't it? Thank you.
I can remember in junior school he was clearly a committed Christian teacher, taking many assemblies around the Christian faith. And I can't remember the themes of much of them, but I do remember the feeling. And he made me feel like, if that's what being a Christian is like, I want to be a Christian like you, even though I can't remember anything of what he said.
Well, that's wonderful, Paul. Thank you very much. That's fantastic, because it's the feelings. And I can't tell you enough how the fact that when you go into schools and lead collective worship in schools, you may be the only Christian they come into contact with. So what a powerful role you have to play in schools. And you may be that same person that Paul experienced as well. Thank you, Paul.
Helen, like you, I was a teacher for many years, and I was asked to take assemblies. And what amazed me over those years was the change in the children. We became much more multicultural, and I had to learn quite a lot about major faiths of different religions while still being that having the integrity of being a committed Christian. So my language changed. And as Andy said, it was an invitation because I was saying things as a Christian. So although I had respect for other faiths and their festivals and things, the children, I feel, always knew that deep at heart I was a Christian sharing my faith.
Indeed, and that's totally fine to say I believe when you're leading collective worship now, because as Christian that's totally fine to say that as well.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for sharing. I do appreciate your views. I think they're really valuable, but you can see from there the impact that collective worship's had on you, and so therefore it will have the same impact on the children that you speak to as well.
Can I just say that it can have a negative impact, because I can remember the very first assembly I had back in the 1950s. I was smacked during it.
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
I wasn't listening properly.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Goodness. Well, that is awful, isn't it? So I am sorry to hear that, but hopefully that's past now, I hope.
Yeah, I'm over it.
No, at least for the other children that would experience it. Thank you.
Can I chip in as well, that I can always remember as a child in primary school, at a church school, collective worship, or assemblies as it was known, there was always led by the head teacher, never by anybody else. And in fact, it was a placement for curates, and all the curates and the priests seemed a little nervous and edgy and scared of leading. They would come into class and teach, but to teach a whole school assembly as it was then, they were incredibly nervous about it, and I don't think we ever saw them do that. So
I think that's often the case. I think a 5-year-old can be more intimidating. One 5-year-old can be more intimidating than the whole congregation for some of our curates, I should imagine.
Helen, can I just say something about beating heart? Because I think it's one of the few times in the school day and diary when so many children get together. It's not usually the whole school anymore, but and to be focused on something, not them. And the school I do this in most, that the children are leading, so it's a kind of, and the parents come, so there is a real sense of being together, singing, worshipping, and that's just so key, I think, to the whole school.
It is indeed. Thank you very much for bringing that up, because it's something that I feel really passionate about. That collective worship, when a church school is a very successful church school, it will be where collective worship is the beating heart of school life. And obviously, where the school where you work, they're very much on that journey and on the right path. If collective worship is an add-on in school life and is not the beating heart of school life, pulling in the school vision and pulling in the ethos of the school, and is just a telling off time, we are really doing the children in our care across our diocese a real disservice. So I very much hold on to the idea about the heart, as collective worship being the heart of school life, and the importance of it beating strongly. Okay, so the Church of England guidance document that I'm referring to today, it outlines the purpose, and the other accompanying documents that I'm going to refer to talk about the purpose of collective worship. And it's pulling also some of those views that you've already shared about, because it allows pupils and adults to step away from the target-driven culture of much of education, creating a space for an encounter with a faith in God. It provides opportunities to reflect on larger questions of meaning and purpose. They should expect, the pupils and adults should expect, that collective worship practices share a shared set of signs, symbols, and actions. And that shared set allow the school community to really draw upon the same language in times of joy and in times of grief. Collective worship should be a sense of fellowship and cohesion. and whether in times of crisis or celebration, a time set aside to provide staff and pupils to gather and support one another as a community. That, in a simple paragraph, is the very essence of what collective worship is about. There are a few documents that really do shape and guide collective worship in our church schools. There is the guidance document from the Department of Education, and there is the SIAMS inspection schedule. Collective worship is inspected as a separate strand when your school has a church school inspection. If you haven't read your church school's SIAMS inspection, it will be on your school's website, so do take some time to have a look at that sometime. It should also refer to collective worship. The inspection schedule has changed in the last 18 months, so if it's an old inspection report, it might not be as up to date, and they'll be needing your help, I'm sure, as they prepare for their SIAMS inspection. But the key document that was brought out by the Church of England relating to collective worship most recently is called Inclusive, Invitational and Inspiring. And the Church of England, led by Derek Holloway, and in conjunction with the dioceses across the country, contributed to this very small, short document. Some of the practice in this document you will doubtlessly be doing in the way that you deliver collective worship. But it is also a requirement of the Church of England that dioceses open up training to the clergy and to schools around this document. So thank you very much for attending today and fulfilling the diocese's responsibility for that. Now, one thing that we need to make really clear, and Andy did talk about this, about the invitational nature, which was very clearly said, but collective worship in school is collective worship. It is not corporate worship. In our churches, it's corporate worship, because collective worship has to recognise the collectivity of all participants. And in that way, as you've touched on as well with your comments, we cannot assume the same beliefs and values. Because the child has gone to a Church of England school, it doesn't mean that that child will have the same beliefs and same values. Our church schools are at the heart of our community. So we cannot assume that the child comes with faith and belief and values. And the important thing there is that it needs to, therefore, how it guides our collective worship in schools means that it needs to be non-confessional. Nigel Genders is also in many documents, and whenever he talks about our church schools are not faith schools for the faithful. They are church schools for the community. They are, however, built with a religious character, and people do know that they have a religious character. But they're based on Christian foundations and the teachings of Jesus. So we are examples. We are examples of how we are told to live as a Christian. So we should be compassionate, hospitable. And so should our schools be compassionate, hospitable, inclusive, welcoming everyone. You'll see in your church schools, that you support, their church vision. Again, I'd encourage you to look at that on your websites if you weren't involved in writing it with your schools. A lot of schools will heavily involve their churches in writing it to make sure that it is biblically based. But this is why we really make sure that it's inclusive, like Andy had talked about.
I feel like you think this is going to be a success.
I'm so sorry, I didn't catch that. So this this document, in the same way that Ofsted sometimes likes their, or perhaps if you're leading a sermon in church, you like 3 points. But the Church of England document also carries on with 3 points: the inclusive, invitational, and inspiring. And it looks at those 3 elements: the inclusive nature of collective worship, the invitational, and the inspiring nature of it. And the document unpacks these 3 words, which is what we're going to look at. I've pulled from the document with you today. So invitational. I'll leave you just a moment to read that so you can have, I can take a sip of water and just let you read that for a moment.
Sorry, are you sharing this on screen?
I am.
I can't see it.
Can anybody else see it? Everybody else can see it, I'm afraid.
Thanks, it's my settings, and I'll see to that. Thank you.
So this definition of what invitational means comes directly from the document. And it also is the title of this session, The Warm Fires and Open Doors. I think we can offer to our children this warm fire and open doors because those who come to our collective worship, they can come as close to the fire as they wish. But it doesn't mean that we have to water down the message that we're saying. The door is open for those to come in and to sit as near or as far away from the fire as possible. I think that's a fantastic way for us to remember it. And as we prepare collective worships for our school, to hold that in our thoughts as we prepare thoughts and prayers. Key to this is that pupils and adults should only be invited to pray if they wish to do so, and should be invited to pray in their own way. Prayer should always be accompanied with the option to reflect. That's, for some people, that has been quite a change, because they've always, some people when they've led collective worship have said hands together, eyes closed. But for many people who lead collective worship, that was something that they always offered to children. One way that in most of the observations that I see and most of the work I do with people, I would suggest is that the leader says, I'm now going to pray. This is if they're a Christian, because also sometimes non-Christians take collective worship as well. And so they need to use a language that is that they feel comfortable with as well. So there's an opportunity to pray. You could say you may wish to join me, and if you don't wish to join me, please respect those around you who do wish to pray. Those kind of accompanying words. Your schools, your head teachers or the collective worship leaders in your schools may already have set up that kind of phrase that they want to use with the children. So it may be that you need to have that discussion with the collective worship leader in your school as to what language that they are using. Another image that you might find helpful is the image of a family meal. I'm sure you are all very hospitable people and have lots of meals where you share with family. And again, I think this is another image that helps us understand that invitational nature of collective worship, because all are welcome, but people can choose what they eat and choose what they take. A family time is them all coming together, and that is important, with a variety of menus, a variety of food on the table. Where people bring and share, the children will bring things to collective worship, as will you. So I think that's a really lovely image to continue to hold as you prepare your collective worships. With invitational language, again, I did hint at that with the definition, but if you would like to make this prayer your own, join with me in saying Amen. That's one I use generally when I'm leading collective worship. I invite you to join, or as a school family, our Christian values guide us, or the Bible tells many Christians. It's not a problem to say I if you are sharing your faith with the children. It isn't okay to say we. So then we move on to the inclusive strand and about bringing all the people together. One of you mentioned earlier about the Roman Catholics not being in collective worship when they were a child. We hope that all will join in collective worship. Parents are allowed to withdraw children from collective worship in school. That's a legal requirement. However, we strive in schools to make it as inclusive as possible by giving an encounter. We have to remember that children are at different stages of their spiritual journey, and they need to be given the opportunity to think and ask questions. I love this idea that often when I've been observing collective worship or we've had visitors leading collective worship, sometimes they want to tell us all the answers, and they do think children are almost empty vessels that need to be filled. This very much encourages us to remind ourselves that children should be given the opportunity to think and ask, to consent, and also to dissent. They don't have to agree with us. It's not just because we're an adult, we're right and we know better. And so there again, we come back to the careful choice of language to facilitate worship. Not something that is done to, but is a contributing, it's an offering to the school community. I do apologise when I say pupils, I actually do mean the school community, because I do hope that when you lead collective worship, there are staff there as well. I know sometimes in the busy school life, there are less and less school staff attending collective worship. I think that is quite sad. And I encourage as many staff to be in collective worship as possible. Some head teachers have it as a requirement that all staff are in, and some do not. That inclusion also involves the inclusive nature, also encourages us to think about pupil involvement. I wonder whether you involve your children that you work with in the planning and the leading and the evaluation of collective worship. There's a very big windscreen, really, of pupil participation, I feel, in pupils leading and planning collective worship. On the one hand, it could be the children just coming up and helping you act out a Bible story that you want to share with the children. And for some of you, you may be at the stage where you are really engaging with the children and going with their ideas as to how they can deliver a particular story, or even come up with the theme that they want to deliver as well. And the third I is the inspiring nature. Now, I think sometimes this sometimes challenges us and fills us with a bit of anxiety, because when we have to deliver, maybe you deliver collective worship very regularly, maybe weekly, and for you to be inspiring every week can sometimes feel a little bit of a challenge. But I can assure you that you will be inspiring to different people at different times. I would love to have said that my collective worships are inspiring and every child is inspired to action, but I'm sure I would be kidding myself with that. But I do hope that there'd be one or two children from each of my worship who found something very special to take away. So in inspiring, it's encouraging us to see that heartbeat, that collective worship is impacting the rest of the school life. It may be that an issue that you raise, they become courageous advocates of particular causes. It may be that they then go and do an action, or they raise money, or they act differently. It doesn't need to be a large gesture, but perhaps it's even that their behaviour in the playground following on from something that you've shared with them will be different from the message that you have shared. So pulling some key points from the document, I've taken sort of the 3 definitions that prayer is a natural and valued part of the school culture. I do hope that in our church schools, prayer is happening in collective worship and at different times of the school day. But again, thinking about how we can offer it in openly to all. That we consider worship with a variety. You will come with different strengths. You'll come with different music styles that you could share with children, with different pieces of liturgy. Again, that's very important to share because that's, again, going back to the shared symbols that we have. Silence. I think all of us are a little scared of silence. I know I particularly am, particularly on Zoom meetings when I can't see people and I think it's silent and my mind starts to panic and wonder that you're all disappeared on me. But silence in collective worship, it can be very powerful. And I wonder whether you use that in your collective worships that you lead in schools. And how you use story and reflection. And perhaps you use the Eucharist with children. So worship is creative. Do you use pupils as talk partners? And does it inspire them into action? Will it change their behaviour and their attitudes? That's what we're aiming for. Will they go out and be better people for what they've heard in collective worship? That's what we want. And again, thoughtful and respectful responses from children. We talked about, I spent some time looking at the word dissent. We can dissent by being respectful, and where a school has really got a culture that it's okay to not have the same view as somebody else, we can do so with respect. And in the same way, you can respect children's answers that are different from yours. So I'm just going to spend a few moments on talking about the structure of collective worship. I'm sure that you, as you regularly lead collective worship, you may follow a particular structure that you do. It's called the gathering, engaging, responding, sending structure, or GERS. Everybody likes to shorten everything, don't they? Structure as a way of crafting collective worship. This is how dioceses across the country craft their collective worship and also prepare it when we get resources as well and when we share. So with the gathering, as the children come in, thinking about how you're there, thinking about sometimes I wonder whether we change how you change your practice, whether the lighting of a candle. One lovely way is if you have a candle with 3 lights on it to help the children really understand the Trinity nature. I think that's always really powerful. And perhaps once they've gathered, you share a liturgy with them. Again, if you keep to the same ones or find out what the school are doing, the children know them quite well. But perhaps unpack what that liturgy means. And when you engage with the children, that kind of one message, one key point that you really want to get through. It might be a Bible verse, it might be a Bible story. How are you going to engage in an interesting way? The opportunity then for children to respond, maybe with singing, maybe with prayer, maybe with the talk partners, maybe through creating something. I've been to some amazing worships where children have actually created things in collective worship. It needs quite a lot of planning, but they have done so. And then the sending out. Very important how this sending out is done. Sending out with a final thought, a final word, perhaps an action to do. Perhaps even sending out with something. Perhaps a little stone or a pebble, maybe, if that would be appropriate to your message. Or and particularly a blessing or a sending, again, because they're shared symbols that relate to collective worship. It may be that as you lead, if you regularly lead collective worship and keep to a theme, you may feel you want to contribute to the school's communication with parents. It may be that schools do this through the website or through their newsletters. Perhaps you might like to do a piece on the theme of collective worship. I'm sure the head teachers that you work with would relish an opportunity for you to reflect on collective worship and write a piece in the newsletter, saying what the theme has been over the half term or the term. That would be really helpful. Okay, I'm just going to pause for a moment because the next section I'm coming to is just a few top tips that schools have shared with me and from my experience in leading collective worship. But I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment to see if there are any questions that people would like to ask about what I've said so far, or anybody wanted any clarity about anything I've said so far. So I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment. Anybody want to ask any questions or
So Helen, just worth reflecting on, obviously, many of those on the call won't be in church schools. Now, actually, whether the legislation is obeyed or not, the rule is that collective worship must also be part of community schools.
That's right.
But it doesn't necessarily happen, whatever the rules say.
Well, I'd say in the local authority schools that I am involved in, some local authority schools, I'd say that they do have daily acts of collective worship, and they are very again, if you're doing acts of collective worship in church local authority schools, it's the same way, the same thing you'd use in invitational language as well. It's exactly the same. The Department of Education legislation does apply to them. They're right, so that's why most children will be in collective worship.
Thank you.
And, Helen, could you say something about the Eucharist? Because you said on your slide, you said sharing the Eucharist where if appropriate.
Yes.
Can you say any more? What do you mean by appropriate?
Thank you. Yes, I will do. There is quite in the SIAMS inspection schedule, it uses that language where appropriate, because some schools feel that the Eucharist is not appropriate in their schools. So therefore, they are not penalised on the church school inspection if they don't have a Eucharist. Some schools are cautious about using a Eucharist because it needs to be very much following the lines of the Church of England document, being inclusive and invitational. And some schools are finding that challenging to find the Eucharist service to meeting those requirements, so are choosing not to do a Eucharist. So schools really are making their own decisions about whether they do a Eucharist. Most schools that are doing it allow it as an option for children to attend, and an option for the children to say the words. Does that give that any clarity at all?
Yeah, thank you.
I'm afraid that's probably a bit of a woolly answer. I think some schools are not that comfortable with it, but where schools are, they're doing it really well, in my experience. Schools, I'd say schools I work with, I have some that do it and some that don't, but that's more because of the support they get from the church.
Can I just check what you mean by non-confessional? Because we say a sorry prayer, and we invite people to say a sorry prayer, and we also invite people to say a creed. So are those both confessional, or I mean, I'm not sure how you're defining that.
Yeah. The thing is, the creed is confessional, because it's saying if it's talking about a faith that the children might not have, that is a confessional language. So I think the Church of England is recommending that children are given that invitational language to join with you if you wish to. It doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means that they need to have children need to have the option as to whether they do it or not.
And that applies to the sorry prayer as well.
That's slightly different because you're stuck with a creed. You're saying I believe, aren't you?
Yeah.
But you could be sorry for your actions, couldn't you?
Yeah.
And children are sorry, so I think there's quite a distinction there. And we do encourage our children to reflect and be sorry for their actions and seek forgiveness.
Thank you.
Any other questions? If you do think of anything, or please don't, as I said earlier, please don't hesitate to contact me. And if I can help you at all, I will. It is a very difficult ground to navigate. I do appreciate, and there are challenges facing our schools at the moment. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. Okay, so I'm going to just finish by sharing some, hopefully it'll work again, some tips for leading acts of worship in school. I'm sure you are fantastic at leading collective worship. But it's great sometimes to just be reminded of what schools are hoping for. So firstly, the importance of engaging pupils to support you in leading worship. I have done very many discussions with children about the collective worship they experience in schools over the years, and the collective worship they love. On every single pupil survey that I have ever done is where pupils are involved in the leading of worship. I do appreciate that in your very busy time schedules that you have, you may be just going into school and delivering one and not being able to spend time preparing children before, but children love it. And the more you can engage with them in leading the worship, the better. So please do consider engaging pupils in that way. Now, I talked as well earlier about silence and how uncomfortable it is for many of us. But also I would encourage everyone in the space to think really hard. Just because they're in the school hall and perhaps not in the classrooms where they still need a time to be encouraged to think really hard about what they're hearing. Again, it talks about not done to, but will involve meaningful contributions. So getting them to really think through, getting to think really hard, what do you think? And obviously, I'm sure you'll be valuing that, but getting everybody to think something from what you shared. As adults, we definitely do try and do this, don't we? We try to give them all the answers. But if we can give them the opportunity to think and ask questions, that's really fantastic. I think sometimes we worry that there won't be anything coming back, but children have always got something to say. So do listen to what they've got to say and how they can ask questions for you. We talked about, many of you will have had lots of experience, I'm sure, of training, but the I wonder questions, I think, are a fantastic way. And when I work with early careers teachers, excuse me, when I work with early careers teachers or with people who are developing collective worship in their school, I try to encourage them to use the I wonder questions, because this way in really helps children to see that you are not the expert, and also to allow them to have a different view from you, and that they're more willing to have a go if they think that there's not an answer that they're trying to give you the right answer. I think there are very many times when children are just trying to tell you what the adult wants to hear. But here you're saying, I wonder why. I wonder what this story might teach Christians about God. Or I wonder what you might learn from it. I wonder how this makes, I wonder why Jesus might have told this story. The use of an I wonder question makes children think that you are on the journey with them, and not that you have arrived, but that you are journeying with them. So if there is one thing that I'd encourage you to do in your next collective worship in schools, I'd encourage you to really exploit the use of the I wonder questions. Do spend time. Schools are very, very fast. They're changing all the time, and change is extremely fast. If you can spend some time talking to the collective worship advisor in your school, talking about the structure. Do they do the gathering, engaging, responding, sending? What's the long-term, the medium-termly plan looking like? Perhaps you're responsible for doing it. I know that some of you will be very involved in developing the term plan.
I don't think she's available at the moment. Sorry. Have a good afternoon. Bye.
And thank you so much to all of you who do spend an enormous amount of your time helping schools in the development of their medium and long-term RE plans. It really is invaluable and really is a support to the schools that you serve. So thank you very much. But it is a good thing to do to just really understand what happens in the worships when you're not there. Are they following the gathering, engaging, responding, sending? Are they actually happening? Just really help to unpack that. But help of you to really stick to that good structure as well. That will make you a real example to everybody else, because you're going to be the experts. Many schools say to me about visitors not keeping to the time. Things roll on, and all of a sudden you find that the allocated time of 15 minutes or 20 minutes has gone into 30 minutes. It massively impacts on the school's timetable. So please do also be mindful of the time allocation. In the new school year, this changes again. So it may be that you're thinking, oh, crikey, I've done collective worship for years in the school and it's always been 15 minutes or 20 minutes, but it may be that it no longer is. So it's worth checking in with your school. That key point of keeping it simple, the one clear message, one clear message. That really helps children and those in worship to really focus. It is important that you always go with your styles. And the way that you like to share collective worship. But one thing I would encourage you to think about is try not to make it a performance or a game show. It is an act of collective worship, and it needs to be age appropriate. So obviously using ideas and things that link with children's experience, but not meant to be a really high level performance. And remembering your audience. I don't know whether you've ever done. Sadly, it was a few years into my teaching career before I realised what those 5-year-olds have to look at when they're sitting on the hall floor, or how very low down when you've got something on a table. So do think about how you're standing and where you are in relation to your audience and the image that presents. And thinking about making it age appropriate, which is very challenging if you have the whole of the school in with you, but sometimes key stage worships are easier to lead in that way because you can target them slightly different. I did say to this earlier, and we talked about that. I think Paul was kind enough to share his view about how he met a Christian. I think you have got a wonderful opportunity in schools. Somebody said to me that it's like having the keys to the sweetie shop. You have the keys to the sweetie shop because there's an audience there that will be welcoming you, and you may well be the only Christian that they meet. What an amazing opportunity you have to make your worship truly welcoming and inclusive, and really exemplify the Christian hospitality messages. I think you've got a real privilege. And remember that worship is for all. Children are going to be at different points of their faith and journey. Don't be despondent if you feel that you haven't met the needs of all. I can assure you, you'll meet the needs of many. So finally, my final slide before I hand back for any further questions is really to encourage you to think what you might do as a result of this training. Hopefully it has given you something to think about, or something that you might do differently. I do hope it encourages you to go back to your schools and to talk to them, and to share with them how you can help them going forward. Thank you so much for all you do for our schools. It really is invaluable. They grow and thrive because of the support that their local communities give them. So thank you very much. Schools are going through very challenging times at the moment, and they do need you to be there for them. So thank you for all the time you give. Thank you. Any questions from anybody?
Thank you so much. So in the comment in the chat, Paul is rightly commenting that one of the problems with engaging the children in being involved in leading worship, for example, is it's another demand on their time, and we need to negotiate that with the staff because, yeah, their time is full. And I think that's particularly true in community schools where, you know, there may be less encouragement to staff to allow the clergy to work with kids to build up worship leaders and things.
Indeed, that is the case. I appreciate that very much. But sometimes lunchtime clubs, children are very keen to do. They want to be involved in that. There may be sometime in lunchtime clubs or an after-school club that meets every now and again. Sometimes schools might be interested in that. If it's something that some local churches do run those in local authority schools as well, like a craft club, but the same thing. They worship warriors. You know, lots of our schools have worship warriors, our church schools that is, but not local authority schools. But even so, if that's not a way of preparing the children, they can still be involved in the actual collective worship by perhaps you know, sharing some words or pre-prepared cards, or coming up the front and helping.
Certainly, I remember when I was incumbent of a local church, and we were trying to encourage more of the adult church members to be involved in leading worship. We got, with their and their parents' full agreement, the primary school worship leaders who led things in assemblies to come and do a training session for adult church members about what leading worship is like, what the structure of a service, what we'd call a service of the word, what they would call collective worship is like. That same thing, at first you have to gather, then you prepare to hear the word, then you hear the word, then you respond to it, and then you're sent out. And it might well be that there's as much to be gained from the worship leaders in a school that there is that they will gain from that church involvement.
Indeed, yeah. Anybody else?
Could I ask what you feel about using things like Open the Book as a way of involving either people in the school or people in the church community in the collective worship in the school?
Yeah, I think they're great. It's a great resource. It's a great resource. Open the book. They should be very aware of the Church of England's document as well, guidance document. But I've seen some great open book collective worships in school and very useful in schools, I believe.
So again, in the chat, Jenny is commenting on performance can be very valuable. So for example, puppets, visual aid, magic tricks, things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, they're great. They're very good. Really good. Yeah, excellent ways. Little props that just keep children's attention. Indeed.
Andrew is commenting that Open the Book takes a bit of pressure off her to go into all the schools in her patch. Yeah,
I know, and I know. I think it's amazing that you can manage when you've got more than one school. And my goodness me, it is a real challenge for you. And I don't want you to feel the guilt, extra guilt on your shoulders at all about it, because it's, even if you can just even offer worship monthly, then that's still a lovely way of getting into school. Okay, I think, is that it for questions? Thank you very much. Thank you so much for your time. It's been I've been delighted that so many of you have attended, and if there is any feedback or you, please don't hesitate to let me know. Thank you very much.
and Helen, we're about to unmute and make an awful noise, which will be our applause.
No.